Davin pulled his horse alongside mine before we reached the settlement gate, which was never a good sign. My second-in-command was not a man who interrupted a border ride unless the matter warranted it. "My king," he kept his voice below the wind, "there is something you should see before we meet with the council." I had ridden 3 hours from Ashenmoor's eastern holds to settle a land boundary dispute between Harlow settlement and the smaller village of Creel, to the north. 2 families arguing over a strip of frozen pasture. It was the work of a steward, not an alpha king, and I had told Davin as much when he scheduled it. He had only said that it was the kind of matter that benefited from a king's word, and that there was an additional concern he would explain on arrival. He had not explained it on arrival. He had explained nothing. In fact, for 3 hours of riding, which was unusual enough that I had stopped pressing him somewhere near the second stream crossing. "Show me," I said. He led me off the main track, around the council hall where I could see the village elder Pethmore, already waiting with 2 settlement men, their breath clouding in the cold air. Davin brought me to a cottage at the settlement's edge, smaller than the others, with a kitchen garden gone gray for winter and a door painted a faded blue. No smoke from the chimney yet, though the morning was bitter. A modest place. A woman's work boots stood on the step, already dusted with frost. "The herbalist lives here," Davin said. "A widow, Sella. She came to Harlow about 4 years ago with a young son, Corin. The boy is 8 now." He paused. "The council has asked that she be relocated to the outer border reaches. They say the boy is strange, moon-touched, some call it." "Children are called moon-touched when their village doesn't understand them," I said. "Yes?" Davin dismounted and tied his horse to the gatepost. "My king, I need you to go inside the cottage before we hear the council." I did not ask why a second time. I followed him to the door, and he knocked, and after a moment, the door opened. She was not what I had expected. I had expected the hard-worn look of a woman the settlement had ground down, pinched, defensive, already braced for whatever the council had decided. Instead, I found a woman in a plain gray work dress with her dark hair pinned simply back, holding a small basket of dried herbs and looking at us with a calm that was not performance. Her eyes were brown, very clear, the kind of clear that comes from paying close attention to things over a long period of time. "My lord," she said. She glanced past me at Davin, then back. If she recognized me, she did not show it as alarm. "The Alpha King of Ashenmoor," Davin said. Something moved through her face. Not fear, something quieter. She stepped back from the door. "Come in then," she said. I stepped across the threshold, and the warmth of the cottage closed around me. There was a small fire going after all. I had simply not seen the smoke from the back chimney. A work table covered in bundles of dried herbs, labeled jars, a worn mortar, 2 stools, a cot with a neatly folded blanket. The curtain to the back room was pulled back and tied, and the walls. I stopped. The walls of the cottage, the plank wall beside the door, the stone wall above the hearth, the wooden partition beside the cot, were covered in drawings. Not scrawled, not the half-formed marks of a child who had been given charcoal and told to keep quiet. These were careful, considered, drawn and redrawn, dozens of them, some on loose paper pinned with small nails, some drawn directly onto the plank wall in charcoal. A face, the same face, over and over, in different lights, at different angles. Full frontal, 3/4, looking down, looking up, looking aside. A man's face, strong jaw, a scar at the left brow that cut through, healed clean. Eyes that in the drawings were made of careful cross-hatching because the child who drew them did not have the means to show color, only shape. My face. The room went very quiet, not outside. Outside the wind still moved and the horses stamped. But inside my own thinking. Something settled. Something that had been held slightly open for as long as I could remember simply closed, like a door finding its frame at last, with the softest and most certain sound. I was aware of Davin behind me, saying nothing. I was aware of Sella watching me from 2 paces away, still holding her basket of dried herbs, very still. I turned and looked at her. "Your son drew these," I said. "Yes," she said. "How long?" She set the basket down on the work table without looking at it. Her hands were steady. "He began after the moonlight 3 autumns ago. He was 5. He sat down at this table with a piece of charcoal and drew a face, and when I asked him whose face it was, he looked at me as if I had asked him something obvious and said, 'The man.' He has never offered another explanation. He has drawn that face, the same face, for 3 years. I looked back at the walls. 3 years. Corin had been 5 when he sat down at that table. He had been drawing my face since he was 5 years old, in a border settlement I had never visited, from a face he had never seen. "You have never brought him to the capital," I said. "We have never left Harlow," she said. "I have no reason to travel, and Corin does not do well with long journeys." Has anyone told you whose face this is? She was quiet for a moment. It was not the quiet of someone who did not know the answer. It was the quiet of someone who had been living with an answer for a long time and had not been certain until the last several minutes whether to say it aloud. No one has told me, she said, but I recognized you when you came to the door. She paused. You have a scar at the left brow. He has drawn it exactly. I had received that scar in a border skirmish 11 years ago. I had never been to Harlow settlement. No image of me had ever been distributed to the northern border villages. I had always considered that a vanity I had no patience for. There was no portrait of me in any common place that a child in Harlow could have seen. The fire settled in the hearth behind us. Where is your son? I asked. He was in the back room. She moved to the curtained doorway and pushed it open. Corin. A boy appeared. He was slight for 8, with his mother's coloring, dark hair, dark eyes, and the careful, considered gaze of someone older. He looked at me, and he did not look afraid. He looked at me the way someone looks at a thing they have been expecting for a long time, and are simply glad has finally arrived. He did not say anything. He looked at my face for a moment, then at his mother. Then he went back to the table in the corner of the back room, sat down, and picked up his charcoal. He does not speak much, Sella said. He never has. He is not mute. He speaks when there is something he needs to say. He simply finds that most things can be managed without speaking. She looked at her son for a moment, with an expression I recognized from watching my own officers look at something they valued deeply and would not have explained to a stranger. He has always been that way. The village calls it moon-touched. I have always called it knowing what matters. I stood in the doorway of that back room and looked at the boy at his table and looked at the drawings on the walls behind me, and I thought about the moon rite 3 autumns ago. I had stood in the great hall at Ashenmore and gone through the forms of the rite as I did every year, and nothing had happened, as it had not happened for the 12 years since my mate's passing. My wolf had simply been patient, and I had been, for a long time, not much more than a king with a patient wolf. But 3 autumns ago, a 5-year-old boy in a border settlement had sat down at a table and begun to draw. The council wants you relocated, I said. I know, she said. There was no bitterness in it. She had known long enough that the bitterness had worn smooth. They call the boy a burden, I said. They are afraid of what they don't understand, she said. That is a very ordinary thing to be. I don't hold it against them. I looked at her. She was not a woman who said things like that to seem gracious. She said it because she had thought about it carefully and decided it was true. What do you hold against them? I asked. The smallest curve came to the corner of her mouth, that they have never once asked him what he was drawing. In 3 years, not one of them has come inside this cottage and simply asked. She looked at the walls. He would have told them. He tells the truth, always. He would have said the man, and then they would have known as much as I did, which was not much, but it was something. I looked at the drawings again. The same face, drawn by a child who knew something before he could have known it. My face, held and studied and returned to over and over, the way you study a thing you are responsible for understanding. My lady, I said, and I was not certain why I used the word. She was not titled, not ranked, a border herbalist with a quiet son and a faded blue door, but it was the word that came. May I sit? She looked briefly surprised. Then she gestured to the stool nearest the hearth. Of course, she said. I sat. After a moment, she sat across from me on the work table's edge, her hands resting open in her lap, and she waited. She was very good at waiting. I had the impression she had spent a great deal of her life waiting for things she could not hurry, and had made a kind of peace with that. Tell me about him, I said. From the beginning. She did. Corin had been born with his father's quietness and his mother's steadiness. Her words, said plainly, with no sorrow about the father's quietness being past tense now. Her mate had died of a fever 3 winters after Corin was born. She had come to Harlow because it was a place that needed a herbalist and she had the skill. She had expected it to be temporary. It had become permanent in the way that things do when you are simply too tired to move on, and then, without your noticing, you have put down roots. Corin had always noticed things. He noticed the way certain plants grew toward light and others grew toward stone. He noticed when a person was in pain before they said so. He noticed when the weather was about to turn 2 days before any other sign appeared. The settlement folk had found this unnerving at first, then useful, and then, when the drawings began, suddenly threatening again. People were not consistent, she said. They would accept a useful strangeness and reject a strangeness that looked like faith. He drew your face the morning after the moonrite, she said. I remember because the moonrite had been the night before, and I had sat outside the cottage watching the light and thinking about my mate and feeling, she stopped for a moment, feeling that something had shifted. I didn't know what. The next morning, Corin sat down and began. He drew until the light failed. He has drawn that same face every day since, more or less. I thought about the morning after that moonrite 3 years ago. I had woken with the particular heaviness of a ceremony that had again passed without consequence. I had sat at my study window for a long time. Something had shifted, I had thought, and then dismissed it, because I had thought that before, and nothing had come of it. I had not looked hard enough. You were not frightened of the drawings, I said. He was 5, she said, and he was careful. And the face, it was a kind face. She looked at the wall for a moment. Or not kind exactly. I don't know if kind is quite the word. I used to stand in front of them and try to decide. It is a face that knows what it is responsible for. I found that steadying. There was a sound from the back room. Corin had come to the doorway again. He stood there with his charcoal, looking at me, and I looked back at him, and he said, with the quiet certainty of someone confirming a calculation, "You're him." "I am," I said. He considered this. Then he said, "Mama thought you were kind." "I am trying to be," I said. He looked at me for one more moment. Then he nodded, once, as if that was satisfactory, and went back to his table. Sella was looking at him with the expression I had noticed before. She turned to me, and there was something in her eyes that I could not yet name, something between knowing and not wanting to assume. "The council will be waiting," she said. "Yes," I said. I did not move from the stool. "What do you want, my lady? Not what the council wants. Not what is easiest. What do you want?" She looked at me for a long moment. The fire moved. Outside, the wind pushed through the eaves. "I want Corin to be seen as what he is," she said carefully. "Not feared, not relocated, not managed. Seen." She paused. "I want him to have room to grow into whatever this is." She glanced at the drawings. "I have no name for it. I have simply been keeping him safe until it became clear." "It is becoming clear," I said. "Yes," she said. "I can see that." I stood, and the mark appeared. Not loudly, no blaze, no sudden scorching heat. Not the way the old songs describe a mate bond arriving, with all the drama of a storm. It arrived the way the thing it had always been, quiet, certain, and already complete. I felt it first as a warmth at my left wrist, and I looked down and saw the silver-white mark rising through the skin, the way frost patterns rise on glass in the night, tracing itself, deliberate, unhurried. When I looked up, Sella was looking at her own left wrist, where the same pattern was appearing. She looked up and met my eyes. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Then she said, in a voice that was entirely steady, "I thought it might be something like this." "How long?" I asked. "Since the first time Corin drew that scar." She touched her own wrist lightly with one finger, watching the frost-white lines settle. "Not certain. Only, I thought there was a reason I could not bring myself to take the drawings down. I would look at them and think, I should cover these walls with something useful, and then I would find I couldn't. I told myself it was because they mattered to him." She paused. "They did, but that was not all." From the back room, Corin appeared again. He stood in the doorway looking at our wrists, and his expression shifted in a way I had not seen it shift before. Not surprise, but something like the quiet satisfaction of a very long task finally finished. He looked at me. He looked at his mother. He said, "Good," and went back to his table. There was a silence in which I became aware that Davin was still standing near the door, which he had carefully not closed, and which I had entirely forgotten about. "My king," Davin said. He was not quite managing to keep the warmth out of his voice. "Yes," I said. "I know." "The council," he said. "The council can wait 10 more minutes," I said. I turned back to Sella, who was still watching me with that expression, knowing, and not wanting to assume. I had the sense that she had not often been given room to want things, and that she would not ask for room now even if it was hers. "I would like to speak with the council," I said, "and when I am done with the council, I would like to speak with you, if you are willing." "I am willing," she said. I went to meet Pethmore and the settlement men. The council hall was a low-beamed room with a single long table, 4 rushlights, and the kind of wood smoke smell that gets into the walls over decades and does not come out. Pethmore was standing when I entered, and the 2 settlement men were standing as well, and they all made their bows with the particular stiffness of men who have been waiting longer than they expected, and are not certain whether to be anxious about it. I sat down. After a moment, they sat. Pethmore was a heavy-set man of 60 or so, with a gray beard and the careful eyes of someone accustomed to managing small disputes without outside interference. He had, I suspected, not expected the Alpha King to appear in person over a pasture boundary, and what he had phrased in his letter to my council as a matter of community concern regarding a settlement resident and her atypical child. He had expected a steward. He had expected a letter back. He had not expected me. "My king," he said. "We are honored. Tell me about the herbalist," I said. He cleared his throat. He said that she had come to Harlow 4 years ago, that her skills with plants and remedies were genuinely useful, that the settlement had no objection to her personally. He said that the boy was another matter. He said the boy made people uncomfortable. He said the drawings made people uncomfortable. He said that a child who drew the same face for 3 years without explanation was not a thing people knew how to manage, and that the settlement's concern was not unkindness but uncertainty, and that he hoped I would understand that. I let him finish. I had found, over years of governance, that it was important to let people finish before you told them they were wrong. Not because their reasons mattered more than the correction, but because a man who has not been heard will argue. A man who has been heard will more often simply receive the correction and adjust. "I understand the discomfort," I said when he was done. "I do not share it. What Corin carries is a gift from the moon, and the moon's business is not generally governed by settlement councils." I kept my voice level. "The relocation you have requested will not proceed. Sella and her son will remain in Harlow for the present, and, when they choose to leave, they will leave of their own accord and at a time of their choosing. If this council takes any further action against them, against their cottage, their livelihood, their standing in the settlement, you will take it against the Crown's explicit interest, and I will treat it accordingly." There was a silence. Pethmore was a practical man, and practical men respond well to authority applied with precision. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I had long since learned that the quieter the statement, the more clearly it is heard by men who have been expecting an argument and have not been given one. "We meant no harm," he said. "I believe you," I said. "Men who mean harm do not usually write to the Crown first. They act and then write afterward to explain." I looked at him steadily. "You wrote first. That is to your credit. Act better from here, and it will remain so." Pethmore took it well. Practical men usually do. Davin stayed to handle the actual land dispute paperwork. He was better at paperwork than I was, and both of us knew it. I went back to the cottage. Sella had made tea while I was gone. She handed me a cup and sat across from me again, and the mark on her wrist was fully formed now, glowing softly in the way that mate marks do in the first days. Not ostentatious, just visible, like a candle in a window. "The council?" she asked. "Managed," I said. "Pethmore will talk," she said. "He always does." "He may talk all he likes," I said. "What he will not do is act." She looked at her tea for a moment. Then she looked at me. "What happens now?" I turned the cup in my hands. Outside, I could hear Davin's patient voice working through the pasture boundary dispute with the two families, both of whom were still unhappy, but were at least talking to each other, instead of across each other. "I would like you to come to Ashenmore," I said. "Both of you. You and Corin, not because the bond requires it, not because I am the Alpha King and can make it convenient or inconvenient for you to decline." I looked at her steadily. "I am asking because I would like you there, and because I think Corin would have more room at Ashenmore than he has here. More people who could help him understand whatever it is he knows. More space for it." I paused. "But I understand if you need time. This is a great deal to take in at once." She looked at her wrist. She looked at the walls, the drawings, 3 years of them, her son's careful study of a face she had not been able to name. She looked back at me. "I have been taking it in for 3 years, she said. "I have had more time than you think." "Then you have a sense of what you want to do," I said. "I do," she said. She was quiet for a moment, gathering it. "I would like to see Ashenmore. I would like Corin to have the space you're describing, and She stopped, started again. "I would like to know you. Slowly, if that is acceptable. I am not a woman who does anything quickly that ought to be done carefully." "That is more than acceptable," I said. She nodded. Once, in the decisive way of someone who has made up their mind and will not spend further energy unmade it. We talked for a long time after that. Not about the bond, not about what the mark meant in formal terms. There would be time for all of that, and enough of the council's business to attend to once I returned to Ashenmore that I was in no hurry to add to it. We talked about Corin first, because Corin was what she thought about most, and I wanted to understand what she had built around him in 3 years of keeping him safe in a settlement that did not know what to do with him. She told me that he could read, had taught himself more or less, from the labels on her herb jars and then from every other piece of text in the cottage, that he could calculate distances with unnerving precision, and had once told her, very seriously, that the closest berry stand was approximately 412 paces from their door, and that this information might be useful. That he slept well, ate well, was rarely ill, and seemed to find the natural world so full of interest that he had no great need of other children's company, though he was not unkind to them when they were present. She told me about the 2 or 3 children in Harlow who had tried, at various points, to understand Corin, and whom he had received with patient goodwill. She told me about the one boy, the blacksmith's son, who had sat with Corin for an entire afternoon asking him questions about the drawings, and how Corin had answered every question with the same quiet seriousness he brought to everything, and how afterward the blacksmith's son had come to Sella and said that Corin was the most interesting person he had ever met, and then appeared embarrassed to have said it. That boy moved away last spring, she said, to his mother's family in the south. Corin drew his face the day he left, only once. She paused. He understood what it meant, I think, that some people you draw once, and some you come back to. We talked about her herbs, which ones grew in the northern soils she would find at Ashenmore, which ones she would need to source from traders, which ones she had been attempting to grow from seed with variable success. She spoke about plants with the same attentiveness she brought to everything else, and I found myself learning things I had not known about the medicinal properties of 3 common plants that grew on Ashenmore's east slope, none of which I had ever considered in any capacity beyond scenery. We talked about the settlement, and which of the families had been kind to her, and which had kept their distance, and whether there was anyone she wanted to say a proper farewell to before we left in the morning. She said there were 2, the midwife who had always been generous with Corin, and the woman 2 cottages down who had taught her which mushrooms were safe at this altitude, and which were not. The midwife had never thought Corin strange. The mushroom woman had brought Sella a pot of soup the first winter she arrived in Harlow, and had never asked anything in return. I thought about that. A king thinks about a great many things in the aggregate: populations, borders, harvests, the mathematics of where resources go. Sitting in that cottage with the frost silver mark still warm on my wrist, I thought about a woman who brought soup to a new arrival, without asking anything in return, and I thought that kingdoms ran on that, more than on anything my council ever put in a document. At some point in the middle of the afternoon, Corin came out of the back room and sat beside his mother on the work table's edge, and looked at me with that patient, considering gaze. I looked back at him. "Does it look right?" I asked. I meant my face. Did the face he had been drawing match the one in front of him? He thought about this seriously. Then he said, "You look older in the drawings." I blinked. Sella turned toward her son very carefully. "What did you say?" she asked. "In the drawings," Corin said, unruffled. "You are older, the way you will look later." He studied my face. "The scar is right. The eyes are right. The older part is what I was drawing." There was a silence in which I thought about what a 5-year-old child had been drawing on the walls of a cottage for 3 years. Not the present, but the future. Some years forward. A face that had not yet fully arrived in its own weather. I thought about what kind of knowing that was, and who had given it to him, and whether the moon gave it deliberately, or whether it simply flowed through a child who was unusually quiet and unusually attentive, and had more room for it than most. "How much older?" I asked. Corin considered. "Not so very much," he said, in a tone that was clearly meant to be comforting. Sella pressed her lips together. I could see she was not going to laugh in front of her son, out of respect for the gravity with which he had made the statement. But it was a close thing. "Thank you," I said to him. "That is good to know." Corin nodded solemnly and slid off the work table and went back to the back room. "He is not wrong about the seriousness of it," Sella said after a moment. "No," I said, "I know." She looked at me, and something shifted in her expression. Something that had been held carefully at arm's length allowed itself, for just a moment, to settle closer. "He has been very serious about this for 3 years," she said. "He has never, in all that time, shown any fear about it, only care. The way you'd care about something important, that you are responsible for getting right. He has gotten it right," I said. She looked at the walls. "Yes," she said, "he has." Davin came back as the afternoon went thin and cold, and pronounced the pasture dispute concluded to the grudging satisfaction of all parties, which was about the best outcome a border dispute of that kind could achieve. He did not ask about the mark on my wrist, though I saw him see it. Davin had been my second in command for 14 years. He knew which questions to ask and which to leave to the appropriate moment. He arranged for the horses to be kept at the settlement's stable overnight. He found lodging for our 2 outriders at the council hall. He did all of this with the quiet efficiency that had made him invaluable for 14 years. And he said nothing about anything, and I was grateful. The evening in Harlow was cold and still, the sky going from blue to deep purple above the settled white of the frost fields. Sella made supper. Simple food, border fare, bread and a pot of something that had beans and dried meat in it, and tasted better than most of what my cooks produced in the great hall at Ashenmore, though I recognized that was partly the cold and partly the cottage's warmth, and partly sitting across from someone whose company I was finding, to my surprise, completely natural. Corin ate steadily and said little. Once, he looked at me across the table and said, "Will there be wolves at Ashenmore?" "A great many," I said. "The pack runs on the east field most mornings." He returned to his bread with the expression of someone who has received satisfactory information. After supper, Sella put Corin to bed in the back room with the matter-of-fact tenderness of a woman who had done this 10,000 times and had not grown weary of it. I sat by the fire and looked at the drawings on the walls in the firelight, which made them flicker and shift slightly, so that the face on the plank wall above the hearth seemed to turn, moment to moment at different angles, and the one pinned beside the door seemed to watch the room. She came back and sat across from me, and we were quiet for a while. The fire spoke. Outside, the frost settled. "Did you know," I said, "that the morning after the moonlight 3 years ago, I sat at my study window for a long time thinking that something had shifted?" She was still. "I dismissed it," I said. "I thought I was tired, or wishful. I had thought that before." "So had I," she said, after a moment. "The same night, I sat outside and thought something had shifted." She looked at the fire. Then Corin began to draw, and I was too busy trying to understand what he was doing to think about what I had felt. "He was doing your thinking for you," I said. "He often does," she said. "He is better at it than I am in some ways. He has no patience for the middle step where you talk yourself out of something." I looked at the drawing above the hearth. The face in it was looking at something just past the frame of the paper, not at the viewer, but at something to the left, with a focus that was almost painful. "What is he looking at?" I asked. "In the drawings. His eyes are always," I gestured, "looking at something." Sella considered the drawing for a long time. "I think," she said, carefully, "he was drawing you looking for something. The way a person's face looks when they are searching." She paused. "I thought it was loss or grief, but it might have been something else." "Both," I said. She looked at me, not with pity, which I would not have known what to do with, but with the clear, attending look that I had noticed at the door. The look of someone who was paying careful attention. "Both," she agreed. We were quiet again, the good kind of quiet, the kind that does not need filling. After a time she said, "What was she like?" "Your mate." Not prying, careful, the way someone asks a question they want you to have the choice about answering. "She was strong," I said. "Very decided. She saw things in straight lines, which I found useful, because I tend to circle." I looked at the fire. "She died of a fever. It was quick. There is something that sounds like mercy in that, and I suppose it is, and I have never been able to feel it as mercy. But I understand the argument." Sella was quiet for a moment. "Corin's father took a long time," she said. "The fever came slowly. I knew what was coming and could not stop it. I thought afterward that I would have chosen quick, if I could choose. Now I am not certain. At least I was there for all of it. At least nothing was left unsaid." "Nothing was left unsaid with her either," I said. "But I said less than I should have said earlier. I assumed there would be more time." "We always assume that," she said. "Yes," I said. We sat with that for a while. The fire settled. The frost mark on my wrist had faded from silver to a warmth I could feel without seeing, steady and present the way a healed thing is, not demanding attention, simply there. "May I ask you something?" I said. "Yes," she said. "When you looked at those drawings, in all 3 years of them, what did you feel?" She was still for a long moment. "Responsible," she said. "Is that strange?" I felt responsible, as if I were keeping something safe on behalf of someone who did not yet know it needed keeping. She looked at the walls. "I did not know who you were. I did not know what the drawings meant. But I felt, very clearly, that they were important, and that my job was to let Corin do what he needed to do with them, and to not lose them, and to not lose them." She paused. "And I was not afraid of them. That surprised me more than anything else. I should have been, perhaps. A settlement full of people who were afraid, and I was the one person in it who was not. I used to wonder about that." "You were not afraid," I said, "because they were yours to keep." She looked at me. The fire was warm between us. "Yes," she said softly. "I think that is exactly it." Before I went to the council hall to sleep, I stood one more time in front of the plank wall beside the hearth, the largest cluster of drawings, pinned and repinned, the charcoal lines in some of them worn faint from years of the cottage air moving over them. I looked at my own face in the firelight and thought about a 5-year-old boy sitting at a table the morning after a moonlight, with a piece of charcoal and a face that had not yet arrived, and deciding that it was important enough to keep drawing until the face came to find him. 3 years. He had been patient for 3 years. So, I supposed, had we all. We left Harlow the next morning. The 2 women Sella had named, the midwife and the mushroom woman, came to see them off. The midwife hugged Corin for a long time and told him he was remarkable, and he patted her on the back in the decisive, reassuring way of someone who is allowing another person to feel a feeling they need to feel. The mushroom woman hugged Sella and said nothing, which was, I thought, the kind of farewell that does not need words. Pethmore stood at the council hall door and nodded at me. I nodded back. That was enough. Corin rode with Davin, who had, within approximately 15 minutes of their acquaintance, become Corin's most interested audience. I did not know what Davin had said to prompt it, but by the time we reached the first stream crossing, Corin was explaining, with more words than I had yet heard him use consecutively, the exact system he had developed for calculating how much charcoal he needed, depending on the size of the paper and the level of detail. Davin asked questions with the genuine attention of a man who found the engineering of a problem interesting, regardless of what the problem was. Sella rode beside me. We did not talk constantly, which suited both of us. We talked when there was something to say, and were quiet when there was not, and the miles passed in the good rhythm of 2 people who are learning the shape of each other's company, and finding, with some relief, that it is a shape they can exist inside. At one point, late in the afternoon when Ashenmoor's outer holds were beginning to appear through the bare trees, she said, "He's never been on a horse before. He is very calm about it." I looked at Corin, who was sitting in front of Davin with the absolute composure of someone who has spent years drawing a face from memory, and finds that horseback is, comparatively, not very demanding. "He is calm about most things," I said. "He gets it from his father," she said. "Not from me. I worry about things. Quietly, but I do." She paused. I worried about those drawings for a long time. Whether they were a burden, whether I was letting him carry something no child should carry, whether there was something wrong, and I was calling it a gift because I didn't know what else to call it. "And now?" I said. She was quiet for a moment, watching Corin and Davin against the pale winter light. Corin was explaining something with a small, precise gesture of his right hand, and Davin was listening with his head slightly tilted. "Now I think I was right," she said, "to call it a gift. I think he knew exactly what he was doing. I think he has always known, and I think the hardest thing I did, the most important thing, was not require him to explain it until it was ready to be explained." She glanced at me. "You understand that, I think. Not requiring things to arrive faster than they are ready." "I am learning it," I said. "I was not always patient." "You are now," she said. "Corin was drawing the patient version of you." I looked at the track ahead of us for a moment. "Tell him I said thank you," I said. She smiled, the first time I had seen a full smile, not the careful partial one. It changed her face considerably. "Tell him yourself," she said. "He would prefer it from you." Ashenmoor's gates came into view an hour before dark, the torches already lit along the outer wall. Davin had sent word ahead from the second hold, so there was no ceremony waiting, no gathered pack to witness an arrival I had not yet had any opportunity to explain. The gates opened and we rode through, and the hold's head of household met us in the yard and asked no questions, which told me Davin had sent a careful message. Corin looked up at the walls of Ashenmoor and was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, to no one in particular, "It's bigger than the drawings." Davin looked at me. I looked at Davin. Neither of us had any response to offer. "It is," I said at last. Corin nodded, as if this confirmed something he had expected to find confirmed eventually. He let Davin help him down from the horse and stood in the yard looking at the hold with that patient, assessing gaze. Sella dismounted and came to stand beside her son. She looked at the walls, the torchlight, the stone and timber that had been Ashenmoor for 400 years. I saw her take it in carefully, the way she took in everything, not overwhelmed, not performing composure, simply present. "Home," Corin said, still to no one in particular, still in that tone of calm confirmation. Sella looked at him. She looked at me. I had not said the word, he had said it instead. "Yes," I said, "if you will have it." She was quiet for just a moment, the last of the long patience she had been practicing for 3 years. "Yes," she said, "we will." That night, after Corin had been settled in the chamber the household had prepared, and after Sella had been shown her own room with its window looking north toward the frost forest she would come to know well, I sat in my study and thought about a 5-year-old boy at a table with a piece of charcoal, and what it meant that the moon had used him, a quiet, careful boy with no interest in explanation, to do what the moonrise ceremony had not managed in 12 years. I did not have a full answer. I thought I might not have a full answer for some time. I thought, Also, that I was less troubled by this than I had expected to be. In the morning, I rose before dawn, as I always did. I went down the east corridor to check on Corin's chamber, quietly, not to wake him, and found the door already slightly open. I looked in. He was at the small desk the household had put there, already awake, already at work. He had found a new sheet of paper. He had found a new piece of charcoal. He was not drawing a face. He was drawing the east field, the frost field that ran below Ashenmoor's walls, the bare trees at its edge, the shapes of what would be the wolves' morning run, still empty at this hour. He was drawing it carefully, with the same attention he had given to 3 years of a face, but it was not the face. It was a place. It was this place. It was home, rendered in charcoal by a boy who had spent 3 years drawing the path that led here, and who had now, apparently, arrived. He looked up and saw me in the doorway. He said nothing. I said nothing. He looked back at his drawing and added a line of trees, precise and patient, at the far edge. I pulled the door gently closed and stood in the corridor and thought about what it meant, to have been drawn towards something, drawn towards someone, by a force that worked through the smallest and quietest channel it could find, not through ceremony, not through the formal instruments of a mate bond's announcement, through a child with charcoal and a window, and 3 years of faithful attention. I had been the king of this hold for a long time, and I had governed it, I believed, with care. But there are things that cannot be governed. There are things that can only be received, when they are ready, by someone who has learned, finally, slowly, to stop requiring them to arrive faster than they are. Sella was patient. Corin was patient. I was learning to be. That was enough, I thought, for one morning. I went downstairs to put the kettle on and to wait for them.